Ma'am, this hearing is for counsel only. Out. Now. His voice didn't just fill the room. It cut through it, like a gavel slammed on the wrong name. Every head in the courtroom turned at once. And in the silence that followed, you could almost hear dignity crack under the weight of his tone. A tall white clerk in a navy vest stood at the center aisle, his arm stiffly raised toward the door. His finger pointed, not at a defendant, not at a witness, but at her. A black woman. Alone. Standing still in the gallery. Her heels made no sound against the polished oak floor as she turned to face him. The expression on her face didn't change. Neither did her breath. She held a stare. Calm. Unbothered. And in that moment, she wasn't just standing there. She was holding a history she'd carried her whole life. A history that taught her some rooms weren't designed to hold her. But she'd step in anyway. The clerk's words hung in the air like smoke. We don't need onlookers disrupting the hearing. He waved at a security guard near the double doors and added, louder this time, escort her out before the judge arrives. From the back bench, a young black intern shifted uncomfortably, his phone gripped tight in his lap, thumb hovering over the record button. He whispered to himself, this ain't right. At the counsel table, a defense lawyer in a crisp gray suit smirked, his voice dripping with mockery. She here to watch her boyfriend get arraigned or something? The gallery chuckled, quiet but sharp, the kind of laughter that cuts more than it comforts. And through it all, she didn't say a word. Not yet. She stood in her fitted gray suit, unadorned, deliberate. No jewelry, no name badge, just a black leather folder held in her left hand. One row back, a woman with salt and pepper hair nudged her companion and whispered, "Who is she?" The clerk didn't care who she was. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to lace it with something colder. You people always think you can just walk into these proceedings like you belong here. The word, you people, seeped into the wooden walls like a stain. She blinked once. Then, her eyes shifted, not to him, but to the front of the room, to the judge's bench, where a nameplate already sat waiting, Honorable Judge Carter. Her lips curved, barely. Not a smile. Not yet. Something quieter. Something stronger. The clerk barked again. Did you hear me? You're disrupting the process. If you won't leave on your own, we'll remove you. And this time, he reached. His hand landed on her arm, not roughly, but firmly, like a man convinced he had the right to move her. Like she wasn't already exactly where she was supposed to be. Phones rose in the back of the room. The young intern whispered louder now, this time to no one in particular. Somebody's got to see this. Her eyes finally turned back to the clerk. Cool. Composed. And the silence that followed was heavier than any shout she could have given him. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Judge Carter. The courtroom air had been quiet before she entered. Polished oak benches. Polished people. Attorneys shuffling papers, murmuring strategy, adjusting ties. On the wall hung a large seal of the state, its golden letters proclaiming "In justice we trust." But that trust felt brittle the second she stepped through the double doors. No one saw her as anything more than another black woman sitting in the wrong place. She walked in alone. No clerk trailing her. No assistant carrying files. No robe, just a slim, black leather folder tucked under her arm, and a calm so unshakable it unsettled everyone who noticed it. Her suit was a soft gray, tailored but understated. Her heels were quiet. Even her watch was plain, silver, with no diamonds, no shine. She chose it all on purpose. Every detail, deliberate. Because this wasn't the first time a room like this had looked at her and seen nothing but a body to dismiss. At 17, she'd been told to leave a courtroom because spectators weren't allowed during a corporate trial. At 25, a bailiff had shoved her toward the back bench even though her name was on the docket as counsel. At 32, a judge had refused to look up when she rose to argue her first federal case, asking instead, "Where's your attorney?" And now, today, at 42, she carried all of those memories into this room. Because the lesson she learned back then was simple. People will see your skin before they see your name, your silence before they see your power, your presence before they see your position. So she walked in with nothing but herself. No pretense, no armor, letting the room decide who it thought she was. And, right on cue, it decided. The clerk's narrowed eyes. The smirk on the defense lawyer's face. The muffled chuckle from the gallery. All of it telling her exactly how they'd already judged her. The young black intern in the back corner kept his phone low in his lap, his thumb hovering over record. He'd never seen her before. But something about the way she stood, spine straight, shoulders set, eyes fixed forward, made him hesitate. Made him think. She don't look like she here for no boyfriend, he murmured under his breath. She looked like she here to handle something. The judge's bench sat empty at the front. The courtroom waiting. No one noticed the nameplate sitting there. No one read it. Not yet. It was already there, etched in black and gold. Honorable Judge Naomi Carter. She glanced at it briefly, just enough to steady herself. And then her gaze returned to the clerk, who still stood in the aisle blocking her way. He didn't lower his hand. He didn't lower his voice either. Ma'am, this is your final warning. You do not belong here. You're holding up the process. At the counsel table, the defense lawyer leaned back in his chair and added with a smirk. She's probably here to see her cousin in cuffs. Typical. That word, typical, landed like a slap. But her expression didn't change. Not even a blink. Not even a flinch. The clerk gestured toward the doors behind her. Out, or I'll have you removed. Her grip tightened on her folder, just barely. A detail so small only she could feel it. The young intern finally pressed record on his phone, whispering under his breath, Nah, they gonna see this. But she didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes stayed fixed on the empty judge's chair. Because she'd waited her whole career for this moment. And no man, no clerk, no smirk, no whispered insult was going to take it from her. She thought, just for a moment, about that courtroom in Atlanta when she was 17. How it felt to be escorted out, humiliated, invisible. How her fingers had clenched in shame as everyone stared. How she'd promised herself that day. One day, they won't just see me. They'll answer to me. And now here she was. Still calm. Still steady. Still exactly where she was meant to be. The clerk stepped closer. The defense lawyer chuckled louder. The security guard started toward her. But she stayed. Because she knew what they didn't. She already owned this room. Security, remove her. The clerk's words rang out louder now, sharp enough to make the gallery fall completely silent. All the shuffling stopped. All the murmurs died. Even the defense attorney, still lounging smugly at the counsel table, paused mid-chuckle to watch. From the corner of the room, the security guard straightened his navy blazer and began walking toward her. Heavy boots echoing on the wood. Each step closer than the last. You heard the clerk, ma'am, he said flatly, his hand resting on his belt. This area is for court officers and verified counsel. You don't belong here. She still didn't flinch. Didn't even look at him. Her eyes stayed on the empty judge's chair. But the room wasn't quiet anymore. It was charged. A woman sitting 2 rows back leaned toward her husband, whispering. Why doesn't she just leave? What's she trying to prove? The clerk folded his arms, emboldened now, stepping closer as if every inch he gained over her restored his own fragile power. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, he said, his voice low but dripping with disdain. You've already caused enough of a scene. The security guard reached out, 2 fingers grazing her elbow now. Firm, possessive, like he was moving furniture. She finally turned her head, her gaze cutting to the side, just enough to meet his eyes. Calm, unimpressed. And in that quiet, he hesitated, just for half a second. But the clerk didn't notice. He only noticed the gallery's attention shifting. He only noticed the young black intern in the corner, holding his phone up higher now, the little red record light blinking brighter by the second. Stop filming in here. The clerk barked suddenly, his confidence cracking just enough to let his anger bleed through. You. Put that away or I'll confiscate it. But the intern didn't lower his hand. Instead, his voice carried just loud enough to echo. Somebody gotta see how y'all act. A ripple of murmurs followed. A handful of people, silent until now, began glancing between the clerk, the guard, and her. Their expressions shifting. Not fully on her side yet, but curious, wary, awake. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, his feet crossed at the ankles under the table. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice dry with amusement. Bailiff, just drag her out. We have better things to do than wait for some observer to make her point. That word, observer, hung in the air, heavier than it should have. The clerk sneered, as if that settled it. You heard him. If you won't walk, we'll make you. Then, as if to punctuate the threat, he snatched the leather folder from her hand. The sound of it tearing away broke the silence like a crack of thunder. Gasps rose from the back. The intern's voice again, louder now. "You can't do that. That's her property." But the clerk ignored him. He held the folder high, waving it like a trophy. "What is this anyway? Fake paperwork? You think a cheap prop in a good suit can fool a courtroom? Who do you think you are?" That line, the one so many had thrown at her before, landed just as expected. But her gaze didn't waver, didn't rise to meet his. She simply exhaled. Slow, measured, like a storm gathering its strength. And then she moved. Not toward the door, not toward the clerk, but forward, toward the bench. The guard stiffened, his fingers brushing his holster now. The clerk barked, "You stop right there." And his voice cracked just enough to betray the fear beneath his anger. But she didn't stop. Every step closer to the judge's chair sent another wave through the room. More phones came up. More whispers hissed through the gallery. The young intern's voice cut through them all. "Keep recording. Y'all about to see something." And still she walked, because she knew what they didn't. The hearing hadn't even started yet, and she was the only one in the room with the power to open it. She stopped at the foot of the judge's bench. The clerk's shouting trailed off behind her, collapsing under its own weight. The security guard froze mid-step, his hand still resting on his belt, but no longer moving. Even the defense attorney, so loud and smug just moments before, fell quiet, his smirk stiffening into something closer to doubt. Because the way she stood there now didn't look like defiance. It didn't look like protest. It looked like something else entirely. Authority. She placed her palms flat on the polished wood of the bench and leaned in slightly, her eyes sweeping the courtroom in one slow, deliberate arc. From the gallery, to the clerk, to the counsel table, and finally back to the empty chair waiting just a few feet above her. The clerk was the first to break. "Ma'am, this is your final warning." His voice cracked on the last syllable. But she didn't turn, didn't answer, didn't even blink. The silence that followed stretched across the room like a taut wire, buzzing faintly under the weight of too many eyes watching, waiting. She straightened, adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, and then, quietly, calmly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "Carla," she said, her voice low but clear, "activate Protocol 12. Timestamp this interaction and notify the board that the hearing is in session." On the other end, her assistant's voice came through instantly, clipped and professional. "Understood, Judge Carter. Protocol 12 active. All communications logged. Do you require me to patch in the ethics committee now?" "Not yet," she replied, her tone unhurried. "Let them stew for a moment." The clerk's face drained of color at the sound of the words, "Judge Carter," but he still barked, trying to salvage what little authority he thought he still had. You're impersonating a judge now? That's contempt. That's fraud." She lowered the phone slowly and finally looked at him. Really looked. And in her gaze was no anger. No heat. Just a quiet certainty sharper than any shout could ever be. "You mistook silence for submission," she said evenly. "That was your last mistake." Gasps rippled through the gallery, quiet at first, then louder as the words sank in. The young black intern in the corner whispered under his breath, "Oh, damn." She didn't acknowledge the reaction. Didn't need to. Her eyes stayed locked on the clerk, who now stood motionless in the center aisle. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, his own words failing him for the first time that morning. And still, she didn't raise her voice. Didn't move an inch from where she stood. She simply folded her hands neatly over the black leather folder the clerk had tried to snatch from her moments earlier and placed it back on the bench. The room wasn't quiet anymore, but it wasn't loud either. It was something else, charged, heavy, like a storm was coming and everyone could feel it in their chest. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably at the counsel table. His pen slipped from his fingers and rolled to the floor. For once, he didn't bother picking it up. And in the back row, the young intern finally lifted his phone high enough for everyone to see and whispered, "Let the whole world watch." But she only stood there, still, steady, anchored, because in rooms like this, power didn't come from how loud you were. It came from how long you could stand in silence while everyone else fell apart around you. And she had learned long ago, she could stand longer than any of them. The courtroom wasn't silent anymore. The air had shifted, thicker now, humming with something unspoken yet undeniable. Every eye in the gallery was on her. Even the ones who had scoffed when she first walked in. Even the ones who had chuckled when the clerk pointed to the door. Even the ones who muttered, "Just leave," under their breath. Now they watched. Phones rising in shaky hands. Little red lights blinking like quiet witnesses. Whispers spreading from row to row, too low to catch, but too loud to ignore. "That's her name, isn't it?" someone murmured. "It's on the plaque." "Look," another hissed back. "You think this is real?" The young black intern in the back didn't whisper. Not anymore. His voice carried, firm now, like someone who knew the weight of what he was watching. "You'll better keep filming. This is history right here." He stood up then, not tall, but tall enough, and held his phone higher so everyone could see the screen. "Judge Carter," he read aloud from the nameplate on the bench. "Her damn name's on the bench." A hush rolled through the room, followed by gasps that scattered like birds startled from a wire. The clerk froze mid-step, his hand still halfway toward her folder. The defense attorney's jaw tightened as his eyes darted to the front of the courtroom, scanning the nameplate, then scanning her face, then scanning the nameplate again. And the intern said it again, louder this time, so even those in the hall could hear. "Her name's been there the whole time." On the left side of the gallery, a middle-aged black woman wearing a nurse's scrubs shook her head slowly, her voice breaking into a dry laugh. "I knew it. I knew she didn't walk in here for nothing." Beside her, an elderly man in a tweed cap murmured, "You see how quiet they get when the truth shows up?" But not everyone was quiet. A young white associate attorney sitting near the front turned to his colleague, whispering urgently, "This is bad. This is really bad." That clerk just laid hands on the judge. On record. His colleague swallowed hard and nodded, already pulling his phone out of his jacket pocket, thumbs flying over the screen. And still, she didn't flinch, didn't so much as shift her weight. Her hands rested lightly on the bench, her gaze sweeping once more across the room. The security guard took a cautious step back. Not far, but enough to show the crack in his certainty. His hand dropped from his belt, fingers curling into a loose fist by his side. And then it came, soft at first, but enough to turn every head. "I saw it." The words came from the corner, from the intern, his voice steadier now, louder, emboldened by the silence that had swallowed the rest of the room. "I saw her name. I saw them try to put her out. And I'm not deleting this video." The clerk turned sharply, his voice snapping, brittle. "You put that phone away, or you'll be held in contempt." But the intern stood his ground, his phone still raised. "Funny," he said, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles. "You weren't worried about contempt 5 minutes ago." The woman in scrubs added from her bench, her voice sharper now, "Don't talk to him. Don't talk to her. You talk to yourself about why you thought you could treat her like that." Another voice joined from the back, a young man in a suit, leaning forward, his voice carrying over the hum. "You don't get to erase her twice." Gasps followed, and then something else. Applause, faint at first, then growing. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady. A murmur of dignity finding its voice in a room that thought it could silence her. And through it all, she stood still. Still calm, still quiet, letting the witnesses speak for her now. Because this wasn't just her moment anymore. It was theirs too. The truth, once seen, couldn't be unseen. And this room, her room, was finally waking up. Enough. The clerk's voice shattered the fragile applause, his words bouncing off the wood-paneled walls like a threat he could barely contain. His face flushed now, the confidence that once clung to him slipping away, replaced by something darker. Fear trying to disguise itself as fury. "You think you can just walk in here, sit wherever you want, and what? Pretend you run the place? This is a courtroom. Not your little protest rally." The room went still again, though the quiet wasn't on his side anymore. The young intern lowered his phone just enough to shake his head, muttering under his breath, "Man, you really don't know who you talking to." But the clerk pressed on, his voice rising, desperate now. "You're disrupting legal proceedings, you're impersonating an officer of the court, and you." He stopped, searching for words, eyes darting to the security guard as if pleading for backup. The guard stayed where he was, his stance softer than before, his eyes refusing to meet the clerk's. The clerk hissed, leaning over the gallery rail to glare at her. "We don't care what you think your name is. You don't belong here." Those words hit harder than he knew. The same words she'd heard at 17 in Atlanta, when she was ordered out of the gallery because guests of color weren't permitted during jury selection. The same words whispered about her when she passed the bar. The same words etched in the eyes of every man who called her sweetheart instead of counsel. You don't belong here. Her fingers curled just slightly against the polished bench, her nails pressing into her palm until the sting reminded her she wasn't 17 anymore, and she didn't need to defend her presence. Not to him, not to anyone, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look at him. She looked past him, to the counsel table, where the defense attorney now sat rigid, staring at her with a dawning realization he couldn't quite name. His smirk was gone now. His hand gripped his pen so tight it cracked. And then his voice joined the fray, sharp and rehearsed, like a blade. Your Honor, if this individual is truly claiming authority here, then let her prove it. Show us credentials. Otherwise, she's trespassing and should be removed immediately. Gasps rippled through the gallery at that word, trespassing. The intern's phone shot up again, catching every syllable, every sneer. The nurse in scrubs stood now, her arms crossed, her voice slicing through the heavy air. Don't you dare talk to her like she doesn't belong. She's got more right to that bench than any of you. The clerk turned on her, barking, sit down or you'll be escorted too. But she didn't sit, and neither did the others. One by one, people began rising from the gallery. A quiet, deliberate rebellion taking shape right there in the courtroom. The elderly man in the tweed cap stood with them, steady as stone. A young man in a navy suit. A mother holding her daughter's hand. The clerk's voice cracked as he shouted over them. Sit. All of you. This is my courtroom. My courtroom. That's when she finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached forward and picked up the gavel that lay waiting on the bench. The wood felt heavy in her hand. Familiar. Like it belonged there. Like she belonged there. She tapped it once, soft but sharp. The sound rang through the room like a warning shot. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm. Deadly calm. No. The word froze him mid-rant, his face blanching at the quiet finality in her tone. She raised her eyes to meet his, steady and unflinching. Then louder now, clear enough for everyone to hear. This is not your courtroom. This is mine. The silence that followed was immediate and deafening. Every head turned to her now. Every phone lifted higher. Every witness leaning forward to see what came next. And then she lowered the gavel back to the bench, her voice cutting through the stillness one more time. And you are out of order. The clerk stumbled back a step, his mouth opening, then closing, then opening again. But nothing came out. The young intern lowered his phone just enough to whisper, his voice full of awe now. Oh, she's about to shut this whole thing down. And she didn't have to say another word. Not yet. Because in that moment, everyone in the room knew the storm had arrived. And she was the one holding the gavel. For a moment, no one moved. The clerk's chest rose and fell fast now, his hands clenched at his sides. The gallery held its collective breath. Even the defense attorney stayed frozen, his pen forgotten on the table. And then, he snapped. You think this is over? His voice cracked loud enough to make a few people flinch. He stormed forward, closing the gap between them, his shoes slapping against the oak floor like a warning. You don't get to come in here and humiliate me. You don't get to pretend you're in charge just because you put on a nice suit and memorize some words. He jabbed a finger at her chest, so close it almost touched the fabric of her blazer. This seat isn't yours. Gasps rippled through the room. Phones went up higher. The intern muttered under his breath. Oh no. No, no, no. But she didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Her hand stayed steady on the gavel. And that's when he crossed the line. With a sudden jerk, he snatched the black folder from the bench where she'd set it earlier and held it up like a trophy. See, this little prop doesn't make you a judge. It makes you a liar. A fraud. The folder swung open in his hand, papers scattering in a flutter of white across the polished floor. Legal briefs, court schedules, ethics committee rulings, all with her name printed clearly at the top. Honorable Judge Naomi Carter. But he didn't even look. He just laughed. A brittle, nervous laugh that only made the silence around him colder. Look at her, he barked at the gallery, his voice rising into a full shout now. Walking in here like she owns the place. Like she's somebody. All of you just eating it up because she talks pretty and keeps her mouth shut. But you know what? I see her for what she really is. The room was still, but no longer quiet. A low chorus of disgust rolled through the gallery. The nurse in scrubs stood again, her voice sharp as a blade. Put that folder down. Now. But he ignored her. Ignored everyone. Even as the security guard shifted uneasily by the door, his eyes narrowing at the scene, the clerk didn't stop. His voice grew louder, more frantic. You don't belong here. You never did. And you never will. Do you hear me? Never. The last word echoed through the courtroom like a curse, hanging heavy in the charged air. Papers still floated down around her feet. The gavel still rested calmly in her hand. And still, she didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't even look at him. The intern in the corner finally broke the hush, his voice shaking with fury as he muttered. He just tore up a judge's folder. On camera. In front of everyone. The elderly man in the tweed cap shook his head, his voice low and steady. He's done. But the clerk didn't hear them. Couldn't hear anything but his own rage. He slammed the empty folder back onto the bench, papers scattering further, and leaned in close to her face. Get out of this room, he hissed, his voice low and venomous now. Before I drag you out myself. That was it. The moment everyone would remember. The moment his hands, trembling but certain, finally reached toward her sleeve. Fingers grazing the fabric as if to rip her down from where she stood. Phones flashed. Gasps broke through the silence. The nurse's voice rang out. Don't you touch her. But it was already too late. His fingers gripped her arm. And then, she moved. Not much. Just enough to raise the gavel higher, letting the light catch its polished wood. Her eyes finally met his. Her voice finally came. Quiet. Cold. Unmistakable. Take your hand off me. The words cut through the courtroom like a blade, slicing his arrogance clean in half. But his hand stayed. Tighter now. His jaw set as if he still believed he could win this. Her gaze didn't waver. Her words didn't rise. She just repeated, every syllable as sharp as steel. Take your hand off me. Now. And for the first time since the hearing began, he hesitated. He looked around the room and saw what everyone else already knew. That the power in this room had already shifted. That his hand, on her sleeve, didn't just look wrong. It looked finished. He let go. But the damage was done. Phones had caught everything. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was judgment. And she stood there still, calm, steady, unshaken, while his world began to crumble around him. The clerk's fingers slipped away from her sleeve as if burned. And yet his defiance clung to him like sweat. He straightened, trying to mask the tremor in his jaw with another bark of false authority. You don't scare me. You think a sharp tongue and a good suit makes you somebody? You don't run this place. You never will. But his words felt smaller now. The room wasn't with him anymore. The gallery had risen to its feet. The nurse stood at the front of her row, arms crossed, her chin lifted. The elderly man in the tweed cap now stood shoulder to shoulder with the young intern, both of them filming, their cameras steady and deliberate. And the phones. So many phones. A wall of tiny red record lights trained on him. On her. On the moment. She took her time then. No rush. No need. Her hand came down slowly, the gavel resting back on the bench with a quiet thud that somehow silenced even the most stubborn whispers in the room. Then, with the same calm she'd carried since the second she walked through those doors, she picked up her phone again. She didn't even glance at the clerk. Not yet. Carla, she said, her voice smooth, clipped, controlled. Proceed with escalation. Notify ethics. Notify media. Have the Chief Justice on standby. On the other end of the line, Carla's voice was cool as ice. Understood, Judge Carter. Protocol 12 now escalated. Live updates routing to the circuit board. Media alert drafted and waiting on your word. Send it, she replied evenly. And tell them to make note of what happened in this room, down to every word. Every touch. Every name. The clerk's eyes widened just slightly at that last line. And his confidence, already cracked, began to splinter. You think you can threaten me? You're bluffing. Nobody here cares what you. But his voice faltered when she finally raised her head to meet his stare. Her eyes steady, cold, full of a certainty that didn't need to shout to be heard. Bluffing, she repeated, her tone calm, almost curious. She took one measured step closer, just enough to close the space between them. I don't bluff. I build. I own. I decide. Gasps rippled through the room again, and someone near the back muttered. She owns this place, don't she? The nurse's voice cut through next, sharper than before. She doesn't just own it. She is it. The clerk looked around now, frantic, searching for allies. But the defense attorney avoided his eyes, staring at the table in silence. The security guard stood stiff by the door, his hands clasped behind his back, not moving. And the gallery no longer watched him at all. She turned her attention back to the bench, her fingers smoothing the scattered papers he'd thrown. One by one she stacked them, neat, precise, deliberate. The silence of her movements louder than his shouting could ever be. Then she spoke. I've been called a fraud before. I've been called a liar. I've been told I don't belong. Every room, every table, every courtroom I've ever stood in has tried to erase me before they even learned my name. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. The weight of her words carried across the wood, into the gallery, through the cameras, and out into the world waiting beyond those doors. But here's the thing you don't understand, she continued, her hand now resting firmly on the gavel once more. You don't get to erase me. You don't get to decide where I belong. Not anymore. The intern's voice rose next, strong now, shaking with awe. Say it, Judge. The clerk flinched at the title. And for the first time since the morning began, he stepped back. She let him, didn't chase him, didn't even spare him another glance. Her attention was on the gallery now, on the witnesses, on the record. Every camera in this room is part of the record now. Every eye watching is part of the record. Every word said here today will be remembered. She raised the gavel, just slightly, enough to catch the light, enough to remind everyone exactly where power stood. And when justice comes knocking, it won't knock for me. Her eyes landed squarely on the clerk now, pinning him where he stood. It'll knock for you. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper now. You can't. But she cut him off with 3 quiet, measured taps of the gavel. Court is now in session. The room erupted, not into chaos, but into something heavier. A chorus of murmurs, of gasps, of quiet satisfaction. Phones flashing, cameras whirring, eyes wide. And at the center of it all, she stood tall behind the bench. Calm, collected. You're going to want to hear this on the record. Her hand drifted down to the black folder the clerk had tossed open minutes before. She slid a single page free and held it up for all to see. On it, the seal of the state. Her name, etched clean in bold print. Honorable Naomi Carter, Circuit Judge, Division 3. Gasps rose from the gallery. One woman clutched her chest. The elderly man in the tweed cap exhaled a dry laugh and muttered, Well, I'll be damned. The clerk took one trembling step forward, as if to protest, but her eyes cut to him instantly. And he froze. For the record, she continued, her tone measured and deliberate. My name is Naomi Carter. Circuit Judge, appointed unanimously by the board and sworn in 6 months ago. This bench, this courtroom, this gavel, they belong to me. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need it to. Every syllable landed like a verdict. You all assumed my presence here was an accident. A mistake. A trespass. Her gaze swept back to the clerk, narrowing. It wasn't. It never was. The intern's voice rang out now, strong and sure. Say it louder, Judge. And she obliged. Her hand dropped flat against the bench as she leaned in, her tone sharpening into something unforgettable. You called me a fraud in a courtroom I own. You tried to remove me from a seat that bears my name. You humiliated me in front of a gallery full of witnesses and cameras, all while standing on my floor, under my seal of justice. And now, she stopped, just long enough to let the silence swallow him. Now you will answer for it. The clerk's face drained of color. He stumbled backward, bumping into the gallery rail. No words came this time. Just a faint stammer before he looked away completely. The nurse in scrubs shook her head slowly, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He thought she didn't belong here. The intern added, phone still steady. She belonged here more than any of them. And she stood there still, calm, steady, resolute, as the weight of her revelation sank into every corner of the room. The cameras kept rolling. The whispers grew into a roar. And the clerk, once so sure of his place, could no longer meet her eyes. Court is now in full session, she said at last, her tone final. And let the record show, justice doesn't care what you think I look like. Justice knows who I am. And with that, she sat, not as a trespasser, not as a witness, but as what she had always been, the one in charge. The storm was no longer coming. It was already here. And her gavel was just getting started. The gavel's echo still lingered in the air when the clerk finally broke. He stumbled back another step, his lips parting as though he might still find words, but nothing came. Not this time. Not now that every phone in the room had caught her name, her title, her authority, all broadcast in real time to a gallery no longer on his side. The security guard near the door shifted uneasily, glancing toward her, then back at the clerk. For the first time all morning, he let his hands drop from his belt entirely. The defense attorney's smirk had evaporated. He sat slouched in his chair now, pale and rigid, his fingers drumming an uneven, nervous rhythm on the table. A bead of sweat ran from his temple to his collar, and he didn't even reach to wipe it away. Across the aisle, the young intern stood taller than before, phone still steady, whispering into his own recording. Watch them squirm now. Watch 'em all. And squirm they did. The nurse in scrubs stood at the edge of her row, arms folded, her voice carrying just loud enough to sting. You looked her in the eye and called her nothing. How's that feel now? The elderly man in the tweed cap chuckled dryly, shaking his head. Like roaches when the lights come on, he muttered. In the gallery, murmurs turned to murmured accusations. One young attorney near the front leaned over to his colleague, whispering harshly, We're all on record now. This is gonna blow up. We're not tied to him, are we? His colleague shook his head quickly, his own eyes fixed to the floor, unwilling to meet hers, or anyone's. The clerk's hands finally rose again, but only to smooth his disheveled vest, a nervous tic that did nothing to disguise the tremor in his fingers. He opened his mouth, and closed it, and opened it again. I didn't know, he began, the words weak, almost inaudible over the collective weight of 100 eyes on him. If you'd identified yourself sooner. But the laugh that came from the nurse cut him off, sharp and humorless. Oh, now you care about her name. Phones rose higher. Cameras flashed. Even the defense attorney shot him a sidelong glare, a silent signal to stop digging himself deeper. But he couldn't. His pride wouldn't let him. I didn't mean any harm, he said, his voice growing thinner by the second. I was just following protocol. That word, protocol, drew an audible scoff from the gallery. The elderly man shook his head again, muttering, Same excuse every time. Protocol for who? The intern's voice followed, louder this time, clear enough to make heads turn. You'll only enforce protocol when someone looks like her. The clerk froze. His eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to save him. But there was no one left. Not even the security guard met his gaze now. Her voice came next, low, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. You want to talk about protocol? She leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on him like a hawk's on prey. Let's talk about how you tore open a judge's folder in front of cameras. Let's talk about how you laid hands on a sitting judge. Let's talk about how you humiliated this bench, my bench, while you stood on my floor and thought you could erase me. Her words cut through the quiet like a knife through silk. And you thought there'd be no record, no one watching, no consequences. The clerk's mouth opened as if to speak, but all that came out was a dry breath. Then, for the first time, the defense attorney pushed back his chair and stood. His voice came out clipped, professional, but tight with panic. Your Honor, the defense disavows any involvement in this incident. We were not aware of the misunderstanding. But his words only drew quiet laughter from the gallery. The nurse called out, Funny how fast they say Your Honor when the cameras are rolling. The defense attorney flushed, staring at his shoes, while his client buried his head in his hands. And all the while, she remained at the bench, calm, steady, unmoved. She let the silence do what it always does best, press down on the guilty until they folded under its weight. The storm hadn't passed. It was only just beginning. And the faces of the clerk, the attorney, and every witness in that room told the same story now. They finally realized who they were really standing in front of. The silence in the courtroom thickened, but it was no longer hers to carry. It was theirs now, every ounce of it pressing down on the clerk, the defense attorney, the security guard, on everyone who had stood by and let it happen. Her fingers curled around the gavel again, and this time she didn't just let it rest there. She lifted it, let it hover just above the polished wood of her bench. And the whole room leaned forward, breathless, waiting to see where it would fall. Carla, she said evenly, her voice low but carrying, mark the record. Initiate immediate disciplinary proceedings. Carla's voice came through the speaker of her phone, clear and cold as steel. On your word, Judge Carter. Specify names for removal. Her eyes cut to the clerk first. He froze, his knees locking as she spoke. Matthew Klein, acting clerk. Gross misconduct. Removal effective immediately. Recommend permanent bar from court service pending review. Logged, Carla replied crisply. The clerk flinched at the sound, his breath shuddering as the words sank in. Her gaze moved next to the defense attorney. He stiffened, his lips parting as if to plead, but she didn't let him speak. Richard Wells, defense counsel. Failure to maintain decorum. Violation of ethics. Suspension pending inquiry. The attorney dropped his eyes to the floor, his shoulders sagging as his own name echoed through the room. She let the weight of her words settle before she finished. And lastly, Security Officer James Dorsey. Dereliction of duty. Failure to intervene in harassment of a sitting judge. Removal pending investigation. The security guard's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. Didn't argue. Didn't even look up. The nurse in scrubs exhaled sharply from her seat, her arms uncrossing now, her chin lifting as if to say, "That's how you do it." The young intern's voice came next, louder now, charged with awe. "That's justice. Real justice." Her fingers loosened on the gavel, and it dropped. One clean, final strike that rang through the air like a sentence itself. "Let the record show," she said, her voice calm, deliberate, unshakable, "that this bench, this room, and this seat will no longer tolerate misconduct disguised as protocol. Not here. Not ever again." Gasps rippled through the gallery, but this time they weren't whispers of shock. They were murmurs of approval. The elderly man in the tweed cap nodded slowly, muttering to himself. Finally, somebody said it. Phones flashed. Cameras rolled. And still she stood tall behind the bench, watching the weight of her decision ripple outward into the room like a wave. The clerk, now stripped of even the illusion of control, took one unsteady step back. His mouth opened again, his voice small, cracked. You can't. Her eyes cut to him, sharp as glass, and he stopped mid-sentence. "I already did," she said simply. And that was it. No shouting. No theatrics. Just justice. Quiet. Complete. Irreversible. The gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in applause. Soft at first, then louder, then steady. The nurse was the first to stand fully, clapping slow and deliberate. The young intern joined her next, his phone still recording as his hands came together. Row by row, the entire gallery rose to its feet, the sound of their hands crashing together like a thunderstorm. She'd summoned herself. But she didn't smile. Not yet. Her eyes stayed forward, her posture steady, her presence unshaken. Because justice wasn't about applause. It wasn't about approval. It was about making sure no one in that room, no one watching on those screens, would ever forget what had just happened. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quiet enough that only those listening closest heard. "Court remains in session." And with that, she set the gavel back down, not just as a symbol, but as a warning. The storm had already come, and it would not be undone. The courtroom had never sounded like this before. The applause lingered, a steady rhythm of palms against wood, echoing through the high ceiling like thunder rolling in the distance. But she stood through it all, still and deliberate, her fingers lightly resting on the gavel as if anchoring herself to the moment. Because this wasn't victory. Not yet. Not really. Her eyes swept over the room, catching the faces of the witnesses one by one. The nurse in scrubs, standing tall and unflinching. The young intern still recording through wet eyes. The elderly man with his cap pressed to his chest. And the clerk, still frozen at the rail, his hands dangling uselessly by his sides. His face ashen now, not just from shame, but from understanding. She let the applause fade. Didn't speak until silence returned. Didn't have to. The silence now belonged to her. Then, at last, she raised her chin and spoke, not just to the clerk, not just to the attorney, but to everyone in the room, to everyone watching. "This seat isn't just mine," she said, her voice low and measured, but carrying easily to the farthest bench. "It belongs to every black girl who was told she was too loud to lead." Her eyes scanned the gallery, catching each quiet breath as she continued. "It belongs to every woman who was told she was too soft to command respect. To everyone who's been silenced, humiliated, dismissed, erased, because of who they are, how they look, what they carry into a room. She paused, letting the words settle. No one moved. No one dared. Justice doesn't need to scream, she said next, her gaze fixed on the clerk until he looked away. It just needs to stand. And today justice stood here. Gasps rippled again, soft this time. A murmur of recognition, of vindication, of quiet pride. The young intern whispered into his phone, his voice barely more than a breath. She said it. She really said it. And she wasn't finished. You mistook my silence for weakness, she said, her tone sharpening. My calm for submission. That was your last mistake. The clerk lowered his head now, his shoulders finally sinking. The attorney sat motionless at his table, his pen still cracked in his fist. The security guard stepped back toward the door, standing straighter than he had all morning. And the gallery began to rise again, not in chaos, but in quiet solidarity. People stood row by row, shoulders square, their phones still raised, their chins lifted. A community forming in real time, not just watching justice, but becoming it. She took in the sight, and for the first time all morning, she allowed herself a small smile. Not for the cameras, not for the clerk, but for herself. Because she'd earned it. Because she'd carried this storm her whole life, and now, at last, it had cleared. Court is adjourned, she said, her voice steady as she brought the gavel down one final time. The sound rang through the courtroom like a final verdict, clean and absolute. The clerk flinched. The attorney slumped. And the gallery exhaled, shoulders relaxing as though justice itself had pressed a hand to their backs. The young intern turned his camera toward his own face, whispering into the lens, his eyes shining. This is what power looks like. Quiet, unshakable, black. And as the gallery filed out behind her, row by row, phone by phone, she stayed where she was for just a moment longer. Seated, steady, home. Because they would all remember this day, this room, this storm, and they would never mistake silence for weakness again. If you believe that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard, drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe justice belongs to everyone who dares to claim it, like and share this story. And if you believe silence can still speak powerfully, stay watching. There are more stories to come.